I call this Auditor General Committee meeting of Thursday, June 20th, 2024 to order. This committee meeting is being convened by electronic means as authorized under Part 14 of the Procedure Bylaw. As such, committee members may participate in person or by electronic means. If any committee member loses connection during the voting process, we have staff on hand to facilitate getting you back online quickly while we suspend the voting process. The contact information has been circulated to you. Members of the public can view the proceedings via live stream and YouTube link, which will be posted on X at Van City Clerk. Video of committee members speaking, presentations, amendments, and vote results will be projected to viewers when available. Committee members are reminded to please enable their video to ensure quorum is maintained during the meeting under Section 14.13 of the Procedure Bylaw if attending virtually. The external members of the committee can access the speaking queue by clicking the raise hand icon on WebEx or by raising your hand. In case of an emergency where we need to evacuate the building, I'd like to direct your attention to the exits. There are 2 exits beyond the glass and to the left. If the glass doors are obstructed, please direct your attention to the 4 exits in this chamber. Please use the stairs, do not use the elevator. I'd also like to highlight that there is a defibrillator located at the end of the hallway outside of the council chamber. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. We thank them for having cared for this land and look forward to working with them in partnership as we continue to build this great city together. I also want to take a moment to recognize the immense contributions of the City of Vancouver staff who work hard every day and help make our city an incredible place to live, work, and play. Clerk, may we have the roll call, please?
Yes. Councillor Kirby-Young.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Dominato. Present. Councillor Fry is in the chair. Councillor Boyle. Councillor Montague.
Present.
External Representative Archie Johnson.
Present.
And External Representative Sophia Sui indicated she would be a bit late. I don't think, no, she's not here yet. And External Representative Carol Bellringer. The meeting has quorum.
Great, thank you, Clerk. Before we begin, I have some announcements. Any comments on the agenda item can be sent to the committee using the web form on the city's website. The link to that form will be posted on X at Van City Clerk. I also want to note the City of Vancouver's longstanding commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, including utmost respect for all genders. And I remind council members that, committee members that when addressing speakers and staff, we will avoid using gendered honorifics and instead refer to the person by first and last name, role, or title. Today, there are 2 reports on the agenda, and I'd like to remind committee members that if amendments are brought forward, they must be submitted to the clerk in a final written form before the committee member introduces them. Please ensure the clerk has received your amendment by emailing it directly to Tina Penny. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge that we do have Office of the Auditor General staff in attendance, Lori Burnt, Deputy AG, Jeremy Lau, Audit Principal, and Kenny Cham, Senior Auditor. And of course, we have a lot of city staff here who are too numerous for me to name individually, but nice to see you all here. Okay, so as we begin, 2024 report number 1, follow up on previous audit recommendations. The first item on the agenda is the 2024 report number 1. This is the follow up on previous audit recommendations, and I'll now invite the Auditor General, Mike MacDonnell, to introduce and present the item.
Great, thank you, Chair, and good morning, committee. Just wait till the slides are up. There we go. Thank you, Elise. We have a very brief presentation on the status of previous audit recommendations. Where my audits identify opportunities for improvement in the economy, efficiency, and/or effectiveness of the city's operations, I make recommendations aimed at addressing root causes. As Auditor General, I, quite appropriately, have no ability to compel the city to implement my recommendations, but I do ask Council to endorse them because Council does have such an ability. And consistent with that approach, this committee's terms of reference require it to follow up on the status of audit recommendations. This report is the 2nd semi-annual publication to allow you to do just that. I ask City Management to provide, in their own words, an update on the status of audit recommendations contained in the 5 audit reports issued by my office in 2023. As representations of management, I provide no assurance regarding the completeness or accuracy of the statements contained. Instead, I invite you to consider whether the city management's plans to address audit recommendations are appropriate and whether the reported progress to date is adequate and plausible. City management is here, in a large number, to answer any questions you may have. This committee's terms of reference allow it to ask for evidence. That's up to you if you feel it's appropriate, and I'll facilitate any such request. Audited departments were asked to self-assess their progress under 4 categories. Fully or substantially implemented, which I feel is self-explanatory. It's done. This is great. Alternative action taken. Taking action is both management's responsibility and its prerogative. If management can find alternate approaches that address the issues underlying a recommendation, I consider this both appropriate and a success. The categories fully or substantially implemented and alternative action taken were merged in the upcoming summary table as I consider both to represent completion. Partially implemented means some work is underway, and no substantial action means the department has not yet taken action. I don't take this as a rejection of a recommendation, but more an acknowledgement that management needs to prioritize, and there's often a logical order in which actions need to be taken, and also that action for some recommendations takes more time than for others. The slide shows a summary of what's been reported. I'm pleased to see that of the 33 recommendations included in the 5 audit reports released up to December 2023, the city reports having fully or substantially implemented 11 or 1/3 already. While I've done no work that would allow me to comment on the veracity of these assertions, I will say that it's gratifying to already see tangible progress being made in the short tenure of my office. And I look forward to seeing further progress in the next semi-annual follow-up report to be presented to Council this coming December. So this is the end of my prepared remarks, and I would ask the committee to adopt the motion above. But before we do that, we have several representatives in attendance today, so perhaps this would be a good time to ask them any questions you might have.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Members, you have up to 5 minutes to ask questions. Are there any questions to any of the city representatives here today or to the Auditor General? And I think we have everybody, all the city representatives are here today, so. Any questions? Councillor Boyle on the queue.
Thanks. Is this an appropriate time to ask questions of city staff?
Yes, it is.
Okay, just checking. I have a couple questions for the, well, maybe I'll start on the VPD Enterprise Risk Management Report, if folks are here to answer. It looks like the work for these recommendations is ongoing. The self-assessment says substantially complete. Is that appropriate considering the ongoing nature of the work?
Good morning, Council and members of the committee. Just to introduce myself, my name is Draza Manotovich. I'm the new Director of Enterprise Risk Management for the Vancouver Police Department. It is accurate to say that. There are a number of pieces that are somewhat sequential in regards to establishing enterprise risk management. For the foundational pieces and what I refer to as sort of the infrastructure development of enterprise risk management, those are substantially complete. So for example, our board passed in April the adoption of ISO 31000 as the standard for the Vancouver Police Department and for the Vancouver Police Board for risk management. Today at 1 o'clock, I anticipate the board will approve a policy and procedure for enterprise risk management for the Vancouver Police Department. The board's Finance and Risk Committee endorsed that procedure 2 weeks ago, so it should pass today, along with enterprise risk categories and a risk appetite statement for the board and the VPD. So those foundational pieces are what are substantially completed. What are partially at least begun, is the process of entrenching enterprise risk management as a culture within the VPD. So that includes training of senior managers and developing other sort of tools, modifying a risk register, identifying different strategies for risk mitigation, et cetera. So the foundational pieces, I would say, are substantially completed, and the process of entrenching into the culture and the training is started, and some of it I anticipate being completed by the end of the year, and the more long-term pieces like embedding into our culture should happen organically in the next short period of time, 1 to 2, 3 years kind of thing.
Okay, I know how difficult culture change can be, so I'm curious, actually, maybe I can ask a question of the Auditor General, what the process is around following up on the rest of those pieces and us getting updates on the implementation of the rest of that work.
Okay, thank you for that question, Councillor Boyle. Recognizing that I'm following up really on the committee's behalf, because that's what's required under your terms of reference, I would be happy to take suggestions if you feel that there's further work that you would like me to do.
And that would just be an addition to the direction that we put forward and vote on, to just give direction to continue to follow up and keep us informed on the status
If
of.
that's what you would like me to do,
recommendations.
then yeah, please say so. I'd be happy to take that under advisement.
Okay, thanks. Can I just move for a second round of
Sure thing,
questions?
yeah. Move for second round. All in favor? Or, sorry, seconder? Yes, we need a seconder? Second, all in favor? Opposed?
Aye.
Seeing none opposed, yeah, we'll have a second round.
Okay.
Still have time on the clock, though, Councillor Boyle.
Yes, great, thanks. I have one more question for VPD. So the new director position, the report outlines wasn't in place until February 2024, but the work is reported to have been completed by 2023. Was that just a typo, or can you?
Councilor, refer me to that specific point. The only work that I think would have been completed was the development of a risk register by the department in the fall of 2023.
Yep.
And during the rest of this year, I'll be reviewing the risk register and making necessary recommendations for any improvements to the board.
Okay, great. So maybe I'll follow up with a question to the AG on that too, which is perhaps we can get an update on your assessment of. Actually, I'll start with, do you have a copy of that risk register?
No, I do not.
Okay, is it public?
It's not public.
Okay, is it possible as part of this work for the Auditor General to obtain a copy of it, and then for the committee to be able to receive an assessment of it as part of updates from the Auditor General on the implementation of these recommendations?
I'm going to ask you to, we'll bring that back on the second round. You're out of time.
Oh, now I'm out of time.
Yeah.
That's why I asked for a second round. Okay, I'll come back. Thanks.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Councillor Dominato.
Thanks, Chair. And just as a matter of administrative nature, I just wanted to flag that my staff had printed the reports for me yesterday, and that the printed report didn't include the furniture component, but it does online. And so just flagging that in terms of the table of contents. The content and information is there, but I think we may have just a technical glitch in terms of our delivery of those reports online. So I'm just identifying that, nothing to deal with, or unless there's some explanation.
Chair, can I speak to that? Yeah, we noticed that issue. It was a technical glitch, as you pointed out, and that's why it's been corrected online. And the materials for this committee actually were correct.
Yeah,
It was circulated. But thank you for flagging that.
Yeah, thank you. On that note, I do have a question with respect to the office furniture purchases for staff. And noting that there were 6 consultants, we had an RFP posted for the furniture, 6 consultants or proponents. But I gather from reading the report, a number of them declined to make bids. And so I'm just curious, did we have some further conversations with those possible proponents around what impeded them from participating, why they chose not to, because we ended up with very little interest at the end of the day. And so I don't know if staff could comment on that. I'm not sure who's going to address that question.
So that's a question for.
It's on the furniture, office furniture
REFM.
purchases.
Do we have somebody from REFM to comment?
Probably for finance, with this purchasing. Anybody here for? Colin, can you talk to that?
I'll need to respond to the question. I'll need to take a little bit of time to respond to the question. So, yeah.
Sure.
Sure. So
And I'm just so you know, I'm referencing page 22, just for reference, the table around the comments around the RFP being issued to 6 consultants, but out of 6, 3 declined to submit proposals and confirmed they would not be bidding, and no feedback was received from the remaining 3. However, the closing date was, that's the sort of what I'm referring to.
Okay.
I'm happy to move on with other questions.
thanks.
If just following on the recommendations related to park board revenue, curious if staff could just comment on the update that was provided around why is the board limiting engagement to future strategies, plan, and other work with potential to inform or impact future capital funding requests? What's driving that? And that's on page, it's with respect to recommendation 1.
See Steve Jackson.
Thanks, Councillor. And Steve Jackson, General Manager of Board of Parks and Recreation. Is this in response to the engaging council on future strategies with financial impacts?
It's on recommendation 1. Staff are developing a process map to guide decision-making and responsibilities for the proactive engagement of City Council in the development of current and future strategies.
Right. So obviously, the Park Board has a number of past strategies. I think the logistics of trying to bring all of those to this board, with some of them being superseded in part or in full, would be a challenge. So we are looking with all future strategies to bring those to council where there's significant financial impacts, but a historical bring that forward would be a significant amount of work. And I'm not sure there's as much value in that. Given we're already actioning a lot of that work through existing capital plans and operating budget discussions.
Okay, thank you. I'll pause there for now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Moving online, Councillor Montague.
Sorry, having muting issues. Yeah, just actually just one quick question. And it's in regards to Park Board. It's with recommendations 2, 4, and 5, and I'm just wondering what the time frame is for updating those fee-setting frameworks.
Thanks, Councillor. Assuming that's a question for Steve Jackson.
Thanks for that question. So specifics hard to deliver at this point in time. We are looking on a staged rollout that's really contingent on the amount of resourcing we have to throw out these recommendations. At this point in time, we've engaged or have an RFP out for the fee policy review. So that's a significant piece of work that we hope to wrap up in the near term. But in terms of some of our detailed reviews of comprehensive service costs, developing comprehensive policy around our revenue generating, that will be a staged approach, and we'll take learnings through each of those stages. So we're going to evaluate a couple of business lines in the near term, and then we'll continue through sort of a rolling cycle to eventually get to the point where we've reviewed all of our business lines.
And how you sort of generally talk time frame, but what are we looking at? Are we looking at 6 months, a year, 2 years?
Okay. Yeah. So end of this year, we'll have the business case for Blodell, which is our first pilot, looking into deep diving our costs and understanding our services. I would estimate to cover our full portfolio of services. This will be a multi-year exercise. We can report back for what our priority areas would be for 2025 at potentially a future meeting with this group.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, thanks, Councillor. Councillor Kirby-Yan.
Good morning. Thanks, Chair. And thanks for the report and the overview. On the VPD, and I know that we've got a VPD staff rep, but also I believe a board rep online. I'm wondering from the board perspective, and I realize if you can provide a bit of perspective on sort of the level of focus for the police board as a governance body with respects to the risk management framework and sort of ensuring this responsibility and work is implemented. We'll start there.
Hi, Lorraine Lowe here. I'm here to represent the police board. So overall, we're working with Trace and we're building this ERM first, and then we're going to be creating policies based on this foundation rather than just creating policy and following it. As he's mentioned, the sequential piece is already there. We have approved the ISO 31000, and that's been adopted. And it's basically just really defining the key risk categories and the roles, and that's actually set for approval this afternoon. And we are planning to update that as we go along in the government's manual, and that's expected this September.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if I can follow up on that one, I'm just looking at page 12 of the report. And there's an interesting reference. I wonder if you can shed light I don't know if you're able to comment on what this means. And I quote, as the ERM program matures, a defined relationship between the board and chief constable will evolve and be incorporated into it. Any insight about what that means?
Sorry, just I'm unmuting here. Yes, so we will be getting that mandated. The ERM training is going to be mandated for all the directors, and that's going to be mandated by the province. So the initial orientation is already provided. We will be working directly with the constable and then develop a curriculum underway that is implemented by the province. So there will be ongoing work, and we will be working closely with all parties to get that going. That's with the ERM training.
Okay, so the board is tasking the chief constable with implementing, executing that work. Am I reflecting that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, and last follow-up, if I could, on that also to the police board rep. And that's really around, I know Councillor Boyle asked the question around the risk management piece or framework or the risk assessment, and that was confidential. Are you able to provide any general characterization or perspective of the nature of the risks or the breadth of the risks that are included in that assessment?
Drazen, I believe he's there. He might have a better handle on answering that.
Okay, thank you. Drazen?
Yes, thank you, Councillor. The risks they're quite varied. They range from technological risks that we know are coming down the pipe, such as next generation 911, which is a national issue. It also looks at strategic risks in terms of recruiting and retention of staff, and then any operational risks where we identify it's important that there be a high degree of compliance within the department on basically looking at investigations and ensuring that they're done properly, investigatively, in order to avoid a potential reputational harm to the department or a large loss as a result of non-compliance with any standard procedure. So it's quite varied. It ranges from technological issues, again, strategic issues, reputational harm issues, etc.
Okay, a follow-up on that, and I appreciate that. I wasn't going to go here, but you kind of got into it this morning. Deeply disturbing to hear about the alleged VPD sergeant and the allegations with respects to treatment of women. And I understand, would something like that in terms of, I don't think reputational harm begins to cover it, but loss of confidence and public trust be incorporated in that framework?
Without referring to that specific matter, but in general, I would say definitely it's the public trust in the VPD and the confidence of staff that work with the VPD. That would definitely be an enterprise risk if it was deemed to be that kind of a systemic nature.
Okay, I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
And that's your time. Thanks, Councillor. Moving to external representative Carol Bellringer.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone. I have a question on the building permit fees and one for the auditor. Is there anyone for building permit fees?
I don't see anybody
Yeah,
from DP.
Corio Cal from Development Buildings and Licensing.
So it's actually a positive thing. I'm noting on recommendation 2, so it's looking for written guidelines and standard operating procedures. And there's a reference to a jurisdictional scan having been completed in May. And this, I mean, this is a pretty minor point. It says no substantial action taken. I actually would say that's pretty good to have done that. Like that in itself is a good starting point. And it in terms of forming the basis of a report, that, you know, it's probably some partial, maybe minor, but partially implemented. And I am wondering, and I have a question on this for the auditor as well as a broader question. Could you take a look at that jurisdictional scan and see if, just have a look at it to see if it's going to form a good background for this?
I believe that the appropriate avenue for that would be a motion from the committee, so I'm not sure if advisory members can make a motion, Chair, but I'm sure somebody else would be happy to step in.
I'll leave the logistics of that to someone who knows, because I wouldn't have a clue. It's probably you've probably actually answered my broader question, because, and it's partly on just the whole process, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, so please take this in the spirit intended, which is to make sure we're getting the best information we can get. I appreciate you can't give us assurance on any of this, and you haven't done enough work to give it, you know, and it's carefully laid out that you haven't done any work on any of this. But when you're in the process of even pulling it together and you read the statements, having all the background knowledge that you have, having done all the audits, I would think you might have some observations and you might wish to ask for a few things. So are you saying you cannot ask for additional documentation on follow-ups?
No, certainly not. I think I can ask for just about anything I'd like to ask for. What I'm looking for here in terms of the follow-up process is that insofar as I'm doing it on behalf of this committee, that, you know, requests should come from the committee to look at anything that is of interest. That being said, if I get a report across my desk that looks truly fishy, I will most certainly ask, Carol, without a doubt.
So just following that up, just going either way with that, anything that you've seen that has a relevance to some of the reports previously issued, are you able to state that in future follow-up reports perhaps, to just say as an observation, we did look at this document and it's looking pretty good, or you know, we saw a lot of references to things being complete and we are yet to be able to acquire any of them. Or, you know, I'm making up the examples to try to bring it to life, but I'm wondering how far you can push it without it, because we wouldn't know if you've seen it. I mean, we can go through every report and ask you for every single document if you've seen it or not.
And I think the issue with that is I have to be very cautious about not providing assurance, because that would, I'll run afoul of Canadian audit standards if I start saying things are looking good. Well, under what context? I think it's a different matter to be asked by the committee to look at something and then report back on exactly what I saw. That's I think a very different route to follow. So I'm trying to walk, not necessarily the fine line, but that bright line around either it's an assurance statement or it's not, and keep our regulator happy.
Okay, thanks, Carol. Now, I saw Councillor Dominato on the queue, but no? Okay. I am going to add myself to the queue, actually. Now, and this is generally on the park board recommendation number 1, and I'm going to generally frame this to both Steve and to Colin. Because we do have, coming Wednesday at Standing Committee on Finance, we have some pretty significant expenditures for capital spending on parks. Yet we barely have a couple of paragraphs to explain them in our report that we're receiving. And I'm curious what the process is that staff are developing to help guide decision-making process and why it's not informing our capital report that's coming next week. And I feel like it's a missed opportunity, and I'm a little frustrated to see it's not reflected in the upcoming capital midterm report.
So I would start by saying that all of the recommendations that are coming to council through that report are items that are guided through park board strategies and put the jurisdictional decision on what the priorities are for asset investments with the park board. And then obviously it becomes a request to council to allocate the funds. Where I think recommendation one looks to improve is many of those strategies that resulted in these recommendations that you'll see through the midterm capital update, we would have brought those strategies to council as well. So that becomes the go-forward plan. Like West End Waterfront, we brought that vision statement to council so that you knew financial ramifications of that, council could make a decision on that, and that would help inform the park board as we go forward with our board, understanding what council's appetite is for some of those financial circumstances. I'd maybe defer to Colin if there's anything else you'd want to add.
And I do want to appreciate and acknowledge the West End vision that came forward to council that was very comprehensive and appreciated. It's within this context of the midterm capital update that I'm a little curious how we could improve that kind of communication process between parks and council.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just wanted to add in terms of the process for the capital planning, MTE will have a report that will be coming as well. We have a council presentation next week, and then we'll have a report in July. And through that, there will be opportunity for council to ask clarifying questions on some of these elements, which will touch on the points you've raised.
Okay. Thanks, Colin. I appreciate that. Seeing no further questions, but I do believe there was an amendment circulated. Oh, Councillor Kirby-Young?
Yeah, just a quick
Apologies.
point of procedure.
You have a second round, so.
Yeah, just a quick point of procedure to you if I can. And noting, is this a report for information or what action is required of the committee
There
for
is
the
a
main
recommendation
report?
attached to this, I believe.
I'm just asking because it's a follow-up. Normally we have a recommendation, so I just wanted some clarification.
Yeah, I believe there's a recommendation, and I'm just scrolling. Oh, clerk's just pulling it up, Councillor Kirby-Young.
You can, I've asked my questions. You can stop my clock if you want. Thanks.
Sorry, did you have questions as well, or it was just that? Okay. Councillor Boyle.
Thanks. I just am quickly making an additional recommendation related to the comments from about the building permit fees. And so I'm wondering if I can request a 3-minute recess.
Sure. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, we'll take a quick 3-minute recess then, and
Thanks.
noting this recommendation hasn't been moved yet. So recess is approved. I think we can now resume. And before we move ahead, putting Councillor Dominato back on the queue for questions. Councillor Dominato.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And just following up, and I don't know, Colin, if you had enough time, but just to circle back on the RFP and the furniture purchase, if we could get more details around that particular.
And getting back to me, so I'll have to, again, respond to you separately. Or
Would it be helpful, I don't think we necessarily need a motion for this, but simply to leave it that there would be a report back via memo to council, just outlining that. And I just identify it because we're seeing a trend in the procurement space on the larger infrastructure side, increasingly bidders just not participating, lack of capacity and so on. But I do think it is helpful for us to understand, in this case, we're not talking infrastructure, we're talking chairs and furniture, but to understand what, why people didn't participate, what were the limitations or barriers or what impeded them. And so, so it's not limited to this particular case, but I think holistically, because I've seen this in some other spaces and other environments where increasingly it's hard to get more than one or two proponents. So yeah, it'd be interesting to unpack and understand.
Yeah, I think
So if we get it as a, do we, I don't think we need a direction on that, but just understanding that we get a memo back.
we can provide a memo and provide additional information to council.
That works for everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Dominato. Now.
I'm happy to move to
So
receive, and then I know there's amendments coming.
So moving the recommendations, Councillor Dominato moved the recommendations. As a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Boyle. All in favor?
Oh, no.
What?
We have amendment.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Correct you are. All right.
All good.
Okay, Councillor Boyle.
Thanks. Do we need to be on a different queue, or are we on the right?
I think we're on the right queue. That's fine.
Great. Really appreciate this work and the updates. It's always really helpful for us to see this as an iterative process where we're working together to implement these improvements and we can stay updated on them. And in the spirit of that, I have a couple of amendments that I have circulated.
So we can move to an amendment queue. Okay, Councillor Boyle. Please go ahead to your amendment.
Thanks. Did it get seconded? Great, thanks.
Seconded by Councillor Kirby-Young.
Thanks. So the first amendment relates to the VPD ERM report and simply requests that the AG continue to follow up and report back to the committee on the status and implementation of the recommendation so we can stay on top of how that's going, and additionally that the AG obtain a copy of the risk register and report back to the committee on his assessment of it. I understand there might be some pieces of this work that can't be public, and so trust that either that would be kept confidential by the AG and by the committee as needed. That certainly fits into how we work. And the second recommendation or request here is related to the building permit fees report, and specifically the mention of a jurisdictional scan included in the actions taken related to recommendation 2. Recommendation 2 outline, or the actions taken mentions that there'll be a report back to council in Q3 of 2024, and it would be, we can look at the timing of meetings, but interesting and helpful to this committee, I think, to hear the AG's observations and thoughts on that report.
Thanks. Seconded by, I believe it was seconded by Councillor Kirby-Young, actually, but yeah. I'm just going to put myself on the queue, and I'm hoping to ask the Deputy City Manager for any comments or flags, and similarly the Auditor General. I know there's some chat going on email, and I just wanted to ask the Deputy City Manager, Sandra Singh, for a comment on this, and any concerns or flags.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, I think with the VPD ERM, there may be information in there that that is private and could compromise public safety. But I would ask the AG to comment on how he would handle that information.
Thanks. Mike? We'll just get that mic on.
As part of our work in conducting the audit to begin with, we had access to a wide variety of information that was provided by the department, and under the understanding that, of course, nothing inappropriate would be disclosed that would compromise safety or security. So all of our team have been appropriately vetted to allow them access to that information. I see this as being no different.
Great. Thanks for that clarification, both. Okay. Happy to support this amendment in that case. So seeing no further comments, we can move to a voting queue. And Carol and Archie are non-voting. Okay. Okay, great. So that passes with none in opposition. And back to the main queue. Anything further, Councillor Boyle?
No, that's it. Just thank you to everyone for this work.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Kirby-Young.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I also have an amendment to bring forward if you'd like to bring us to an amendment queue.
Great, so we'll move you to an amendment queue. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Similarly to the last one, I do think it's really important for the committee to continue to have a line of sight around the, not just the status, but the quality of the implementation. I appreciated the questions around the Park Board revenue management framework, but I'm not sure I share fully the same view that there isn't the work to do potentially on some of the existing revenue streams and not just the new ones. I realize that with resource availability, has to be a question of prioritization, but there still may be some benefit there. And I would sort of welcome the committee having a continued update and having a lens on that implementation as it relates to meeting the spirit of the recommendations from the Auditor General. And so in that vein of the amendment is that the Auditor General Committee requests that the AG continue to follow up and report back to the committee on the status and implementation of the recommendations specific to the Park Board Revenue Management Report. And so I table that for the committee's consideration.
Yeah, and I was remiss in asking for a seconder, but I'm happy to second that. So,
thank you.
Any discussion on the amendment?
Chair, could I?
Oh, please, Mike.
Thank you, Chair. The Park Board has reported partial implementation for all 6 recommendations that were in our report. So as a result, we would be automatically following up on the status of the recommendations for our December follow-up. So I'm just suggesting that this is going to happen anyway.
If I can respond to that, I appreciate that there will be follow-up. I guess what I'm suggesting, and we could parse through language, is a little bit of a qualitative assessment back from our esteemed Auditor General as well, not just kind of a completion update, but a bit of perspective.
Okay.
Around that. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, we'll move to a voting queue then, please. Okay, and that passes with none opposed. All right. Okay. Councillor Kirby-Young, any further comments?
No. Procedurally, do we have to vote on the amended recommendation now?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks.
You're still in the queue, so.
No, that's all. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Then we can go to a vote on the recommendations as amended. Yeah, please. Okay. And Councillor Dom, and that passes with none opposed. Okay, thank you. We will now move to that item number 2. The audit of childcare, cultural, and nonprofit leases. And this will be the last item on the agenda. And I'll now invite Auditor General Mike MacDonnell to introduce and present the item, Audit of Childcare, Cultural, and Social Nonprofit Leases. Mike?
Thank you again, Chair. Let's jump into the next slide, please. The city provides nonprofit organizations with below-market and nominal leases of city-owned or leased lands, buildings, and spaces to leverage the expertise of NPOs in implementing solutions and services that serve community needs. Examples of community services and spaces delivered through NPOs include childcare centers, neighborhood houses, theaters, shelters, and art galleries. The NPO lease portfolio includes a total of 119 properties throughout the city. In addition to providing space for arts and culture through museums and art galleries and dance theaters, the city provides low-cost space to assist some of our community's most vulnerable people. For example, those escaping violence or needing culturally appropriate spaces to heal, youth at risk, low-income seniors, and families with young children. In this way, the city's NPO lease portfolio plays a really important role in supporting arts and culture, the next generation of Vancouverites, and in strengthening the social fabric of our society. This slide provides a breakdown of the portfolio by service group. It's roughly a third between child care services, cultural services, and social services. Of the 119 leased facilities, they're run by 86 different operators. Section 206 of the Vancouver Charter enables Council to provide grants to any charitable institution and any organization deemed by Council to be contributing to the culture, beautification, health, or welfare of the city. When calculating the lease grant value, the grant is considered the difference between below market or nominal rent and estimated market rent. The objective of this audit was to determine whether the city effectively managed its childcare, cultural, and social nonprofit leases to deliver intended public benefits in support of its strategic priorities. The audit focused on the period between January 1st, 2022 and August 31st, 2023, and included policies, practices, and administrative processes produced prior to 22 that were still in use during the audit period. We set out to examine whether the city had a systematic approach to ensure its management of nonprofit leases aligned with the city's strategic objectives, and whether it implemented effective processes to manage the life cycle of its cultural, childcare, and social nonprofit leases. In addition, we examined whether the city evaluated and reported relevant childcare, cultural, and social nonprofit lease information to the public and to Council. Only childcare, cultural, and social nonprofit leases were included in the scope of our work. We didn't examine leases managed by the Park Board or non-market housing leases. Each of these categories of lease is managed separately. For clarity, temporary shelters and live workspaces that are part of the Artist Studio program are also not in scope. We didn't examine the services or programs provided by nonprofit lease operators nor the realization of public benefits. Also excluded from our scope was an assessment of building lifecycle costs and associated asset management processes. Overall, we found that the audit criteria were not met and opportunities for improvement were identified. For example, 20% of leases had been expired for over a year, and the information provided to Council was incomplete. And while the city had developed a lease management framework 4 years ago to enable effective administration of childcare, culture, and social nonprofit leases, it hadn't been fully implemented. The framework included key processes, included monitoring and documenting operator performance against lease requirements. As a result of these deficiencies, we concluded that the city had not effectively managed its childcare, cultural, and social nonprofit leases. I'll now ask Jenny Lau, Audit Principal and the Engagement Leader for the audit, to present our detailed audit findings and resulting recommendations. Jenny?
I'll walk through the 12 findings identified in this audit report, 10 of which we have recommendations on. So first, we examined whether the city had guiding strategies that included nonprofit lease objectives by service group. Strategies are important as they provide the city with direction on how to align its policy goals with strategic objectives. We found that all three service groups, the childcare, cultural, and social services, had strategies with objectives for the city to provide spaces to nonprofit organizations. These strategies were approved by Council and include the Making Strides, Vancouver's Childcare Strategy for Childcare Services, Making Space for Arts and Culture or Cultural Services, and Spaces to Thrive for the Social Services area. We have no recommendations to put forward in this area. So the next area we examined were metrics. We looked at whether the city established metrics to measure and track progress and achievement of objectives in its strategies that we just talked about. We found that 2 out of 3 service groups had established metrics with targets and reported on progress towards the achievement of goals. For example, in cultural services, the city defined a metric in the Making Space for Arts and Culture strategy relating to the total square footage of cultural spaces provided and internally tracked performance against this metric. However, in one service area, metrics were not defined. This was in the Spaces to Thrive strategy within the social services area. Of note, within the strategy itself, one of the goals of the strategy was to improve the city's qualitative and quantitative data and metrics on delivering social services in the community. So that leads us to our first recommendation, that the city should define performance metrics and targets for nonprofit leasing in its social services portfolio to enable monitoring and tracking of progress toward meeting the strategic objectives outlined in its approved strategies. Next, we examined whether the city implemented processes to enable effective management of its nonprofit lease portfolio. We found that the city developed a guiding framework for nonprofit lease management in 2020. The Nonprofit Lease Management Framework, abbreviated NPLM, contained guiding principles for various stages of lease management, including guidelines for operator selection, lease monitoring, issues management, and lease renewals. The framework covered the key stages of the leasing life cycle and provided the elements for an effective foundation for lease management. While the city had some elements of the framework in place, the full implementation of the framework with supporting processes and procedures was not complete at the time of the audit. Also, an implementation plan with timelines and assigned responsibilities had not been developed. This leads us to our second recommendation. The city should fully implement its nonprofit lease management framework by developing supporting processes, procedures, and templates. Implementation should include developing a project plan and identify responsibilities for executing the plans, timelines for implementation, and a deadline for completion. So in this next area, we looked at the Making Strides Vancouver's Childcare Strategy, which guides the city's involvement in supporting childcare and identified actions aligned with senior level government toward building a universal childcare system in British Columbia. However, we found that the city did not have a funding model to recover costs from senior level governments that provide funding for childcare initiatives. For example, the $10 a day childcare program covers expenses for childcare operators. These expenses include those such as rent, property taxes, and facility maintenance. At the time of the audit, 26 out of 43 childcare facilities with nonprofit leases with the city were participating in the $10 a day childcare program. However, the city's nonprofit leases with childcare operators only include nominal charges for rent and certain facility maintenance costs. As a result, the operator participating in the $10 a day childcare program would only have nominal rent and maintenance expenses to recover from the province, as the city is funding these costs directly. By leveraging available funding from senior level governments, the city would recover a portion of costs by providing spaces to NPOs. Recovered funds could then be used for a variety of purposes, including investments into furthering Vancouver's childcare infrastructure. So this leads us to our third recommendation. The city should review its funding model supporting childcare initiatives to ensure better alignment with senior level government initiatives. Then we looked at the city's management of nonprofit leases. A comprehensive listing of the city's leased properties is a prerequisite for effective tracking and monitoring of the nonprofit lease portfolio, as well as a foundation for efficient and effective oversight of individual leases. We found that the city had a listing of all childcare, cultural, and social nonprofit leases that were within the scope of this audit. However, we also noted that compiling that list required extensive manual effort because each service group's individual listing was maintained in a separate spreadsheet or system. There are various data fields tracked in the consolidated listing, and due to the manual nature of it, there's a risk that data could be missed, transposed, or incorrectly recorded. Maintaining multiple databases may also be less efficient than employing a centralized approach, so we encourage the city to explore an alternative approach. This leads us to our fourth recommendation, that the city should evaluate its current processes for storing and managing lease information to determine if it could more efficiently and effectively maintain an accurate, comprehensive list of childcare, cultural, and social nonprofit leases to better enable effective tracking and monitoring of the nonprofit lease portfolio. Next, we looked at operator selection. When a facility space becomes available, the city undertakes a selection process to identify a suitable nonprofit operator. From the samples we reviewed, we found that the city publicly posted a request for expression of interest to invite potential operators, formed an evaluation panel to evaluate bids, and summarized the results of the evaluation and provided them to city leadership and council for approval. However, from a documentation perspective, we noted inconsistencies in the documents retained by each service group. 2 of the 3 service groups retained documentation showing the scoring evaluations that supported the selection process, with the highest scoring operator being selected. However, for one area, while the city conducted a competitive process for operator selection with the appropriate levels of approval, in terms of document retention, only a submission summary was retained to document the evaluation and scoring of operators. The service group indicated that while evaluation forms were completed, they were not retained on file. So based on this finding, we recommend that the city should ensure adequate and consistent document retention practices are in place across all service groups involved in the selection of nonprofit lease operators to support the principles of open, transparent, and accountable decision-making. Then on lease requirements between the landlord, the city, and the operator, there are 2 broad categories. There are public service requirements, which are terms specifying the services that operators would provide and the benefits that would be delivered through their services, including how spaces are to be used. Public service requirements also provide the city with criteria on what to monitor to ensure operators are delivering on intended public benefits to the community. In addition to these, there are service level agreements, or SLAs, which outline the responsibilities in relation to items such as property maintenance, repairs, security, and utilities. We examined a sample of lease agreements and found that each agreement included public service requirements outlining the public benefits to be provided by the operator, as well as SLAs. We have no recommendations to provide in this area. Then on lease monitoring, it is important to evaluate and document the performance of operators in relation to lease terms through a formal monitoring process. Documented monitoring provides a history of operator performance and a basis for determining whether nonprofit leases have supported the community as intended. Documentation also supports the city in working with operators to address gaps and, where necessary, perform lease enforcement activities. During the audit period, we found that the city had not conducted formal lease monitoring. While the city had started to implement the lease monitoring framework by reviewing some operators' submissions, this was not completed by the end of the audit period. The city indicated they had engaged with operators to understand their operations through site visits, meetings, and regular communication. Also, for those operators that received both nonprofit leases and operating grants, the city obtained knowledge about operators' activities through the grant application process. And while these activities enabled the city to understand the overall program performance of operators, these activities were not documented. As a result, there was no systematic review of individual operator lease compliance over time, documenting whether lease agreement terms were met or not. So this leads us to the sixth recommendation that the city should ensure it takes a systematic approach to monitoring lease requirements for all operators by implementing a formal lease monitoring process, including the documentation of the results of periodic reviews. So the city may provide priority status to an operator with first rights to available spaces to operate in facilities based on specific criteria and conditions such as location. This requires council approval. The city currently has one operator with priority status, and we reviewed the documentation for this operator and noted that the city had last reviewed the operator's priority status in 2011. While the city indicated there were no concerns with the operator, we noted that the city had not defined how frequently it should review an operator's priority status and seek reapproval from council. So that leads us to the seventh recommendation, that the city should determine how often it reviews an operator's priority status and when to seek council approval. The review process should be informed by the results of performance monitoring activities identified in Recommendation 6. To support transparency and demonstrate fairness, consistency, and objectivity, it's important to document the rationale behind the decisions to renew a lease with an operator. As outlined previously, the city had not implemented formal monitoring against lease agreement terms. As a result, there was no documentation detailing whether lease agreement terms had been met or not by operators over time to support the renewal rationale. We reviewed a sample of lease renewals that had remaining options to renew during the audit period. We found that all 4 operators exercised the option to renew their leases, and the city renewed them accordingly based on the understanding of operator performance. While the city provided appropriate rationale and obtained approval for entering into these lease agreements, the city should include in its rationale the results of its past assessments from operator performance monitoring. So this leads us to our 8th recommendation. So when renewing nonprofit leases, the city should include in the renewal rationale the outcome of formal operator performance monitoring, including an assessment of the delivery of intended public benefits and whether there's continued alignment between the use of the space with the city's strategies and priorities. Then on lease overholds, a lease overhold occurs when a lease agreement expires and the tenant continues to occupy the premises with the landlord's consent. Lease overholds are generally permissible under the terms of the lease agreement on a month-to-month basis, subject to the same terms as the original lease. Unlike renewals of expired leases, the city does not require or seek council approval for overholding leases, which means that overholding for extended periods of time in effect bypasses the council approval required for grants in kind and provides an unintended method for the city to provide a limited number of operators with long-term access to facilities without going through the lease renewal process, and limits other potential operators from accessing these spaces. Although lease terms allow for overholding, this brings ongoing risks. Some include that older leases and overhold may have outdated lease agreement terms without public service requirements in place. The programs or services provided by the operator may or may not be aligned with the city's current strategic objectives, and capital improvements could be delayed, leading to escalating costs for the city. So in this chart here, we show that as of September 1st, 2023, out of the 119 childcare, cultural, and social nonprofit leases in the audit, 34 or 29% were in overhold. So to break it down, 24 or 20% had been in overhold for more than a year. From that, 12 had been in overhold for more than 10 years, and within that, 4 were in overhold for more than 20 years. So we recognize that overholding is not an uncommon practice in the leasing industry, but it's usually for a shorter duration in anticipation of signing a new lease. And based on this, we've made the recommendation number 9 that the city should reduce the number of leases in overhold for longer than 1 year and implement policies and procedures to limit the number of leases in overhold and the length of the overhold period. This includes establishing a priority and a time frame for addressing all leases currently in overhold, establishing primary accountability for managing overhold leases, and annual reporting of all leases in overhold to council for review and approval. And the last area we reviewed was related to reporting. From a program perspective in 2023, the city published the ACCS grant report for 2022 and provided it to the public and to council. The report outlined the operating and capital grants approved by council in 2022 to NPOs. Specifically for nonprofit leases, the report included information about the number of leased facilities, gross floor area leased, and the number of operators. However, in the report, it did not include the total value of the financial support the city provided to NPOs, including contributions to operational and capital maintenance and the annual lease grant value. Providing this, the annual value of lease grants in kind would provide greater transparency on the extent of the financial support the city provides for each operator. So based on this finding, we have recommended that the city should provide council with information on the full extent of the city's financial contribution to the nonprofit organizations receiving these grants. This reporting should include information such as the estimated operating and capital maintenance costs for each lease to be incurred by the city to inform leasing decisions, actual maintenance and capital costs incurred by the city, the full value of the city's financial contribution to each operator, and other pertinent information as identified by council. So these are the findings and recommendations identified in the audit report, and I'll now hand the presentation back to Mike.
Thank you, Jenny. We have 2 recommendations for the committee. First, to receive the report, and second, that the report's 10 recommendations be endorsed. But I think before we do that, Chair, you might want to hear from the city.
And thanks, Mike, and thanks, Jenny, for the presentation. I'm now going to invite the General Manager of ACCS, Margaret Witkins, to respond to the Auditor General's report.
Thank you so much to the committee for the opportunity to speak. Margaret Witkins, General Manager, Arts, Culture, and Community Services. We want to thank the team in the Auditor General's office for their work in putting this report together, as well as the recommendations. Given the breadth of community and cultural services supported by these leases, this work involves a number of teams within ACCS as well as other city departments. And I want to recognize the Auditor General's team for their willingness to engage with so many different groups and understand the complexity of the work and the portfolio. I also want to acknowledge the city teams that prioritize this work and have worked collaboratively with the Auditor General team, including within ACCS, social infrastructure, childcare, arts, culture, and tourism, and partner agreements, real estate services within RAFM, as well as business planning and project support. A number of these colleagues are joining me today so that we may respond to your questions as they arise. The city develops and supports social serving spaces through partnerships with and support of nonprofits that play a vital role in our community. These partnerships are instrumental in achieving council objectives in the childcare, cultural, and social spheres. We leverage city-owned facilities to offer nominal rent and below-market leases to organizations that align with city goals. This approach allows us to enhance social services and cultural initiatives, fostering a thriving and inclusive community. As has already been mentioned, at the time of the audit, the portfolio included 119 leases and 86 nonprofit operators within this domain. The social, childcare, and cultural lease portfolio has existed at the city for decades and has grown in size and complexity over time. In recent years, there have been measures put in place to manage the portfolio in a more structured and focused way. The audit findings align with a number of efforts already underway and offer new and welcome perspectives on how to improve our approach. I'd just like to highlight a few areas where we have work underway already that will aid the implementation of the audit recommendations. The Nonprofit Lease Management Framework, approved in 2020, details the tasks, roles, and responsibilities between ACCS and REFM for the lease management work and outlines where new policies and procedures need to be developed. Implementation was impacted by the pandemic, resourcing, and staff turnover, however, is now actively being advanced and will help to address a number of the findings in the report. The implementation of a grant management system is also underway. This system is used as a portal for nonprofits to submit annual reporting requirements within the lease. Implementation of the lease monitoring framework, which guides our lease monitoring project, is also underway and will be completed in 2025. Nonprofit operators are asked to submit annual reporting as outlined in their lease agreements, which often includes financial statements, budgets, reporting back on public service requirements, commitments, maintenance plans, etc. This will better enable us to evaluate the impact and compliance with leases. Reducing the number of leases and overholding has been a priority since the start of 2023, and there has been good progress made even since the end of the audit period. The current number of overholding leases is now 26, so that's a 24% reduction of the amount in the report, which was at 34. We will continue our work on these projects as well as the additional work identified in the report, which will overall improve the management of the nonprofit lease portfolio. We accept the report's recommendations and are committing to make continued progress on them and see the timing as right for receiving this audit to enhance our work within this portfolio. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Members, you now have 5 minutes to ask questions. Are there any questions for city staff or the Auditor General? Seeing Councillor Dominato on the queue. Oh, and I cleared it. My apologies. Councillor Dominato.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And probably questions for a combination of the Auditor General and our staff. One, I wanted to hone in on the issue of lease management oversight and monitoring, and particularly the technology component of that. Noting that it says right now it's quite manual in nature, and given that these leases have timeframes and how quickly can we put in place, I guess, technology to sort of automate that so that there's triggers for, okay, this lease is up in 6 months or a year, triggering the next steps of engaging with those operators, looking at the existing lease, looking at renewal possibly. And so I'm just curious, because that seems like a really, I think, I don't want to say straightforward, but given the various platforms out there today, curious how quickly you could have that in place.
Thank you for the question. I think there's two components. In preparation for this audit, a lot of work was done to compile various data sources that informed the recommendations that were made for this audit. And so certainly we can build on that data as a foundation for managing this information going forward. We also have a grant management system that has been implemented, and we can leverage that technology as best we can in managing this portfolio going forward. We would look to kind of reporting back on the details of that as we get into the more detailed implementation of the findings.
Okay. I would certainly look forward to that. And, in the context of the conversations we've had, with Chief Technology Officer around, use of AI and other measures to sort of advance that. I'm also curious about in some of our leases, and I understand it's very standard that we upgrades and maintenance of some of our facilities, for example, HVAC, is the responsibility of the tenant, but we have had occurrences where these nonprofits don't have the funds and the resources to do that, and so they've actually relocated. So I'm curious if that was looked at in terms of should that be the responsibility of these, particularly these non-market, nonprofit organizations to take on those responsibilities? Because it seems in some cases it hasn't worked. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that's something that the nonprofit lease management framework will very much aid in offering some consistency and rigor in terms of how we approach those considerations. The framework will provide a lot of clarity on responsibility in terms of who is making those decisions and what criteria are considered in how those decisions are made, and to inform the service level agreement that's part of each lease.
Okay. Chair, just while I'm thinking about, can I move for a second round of questions?
All in favor? Opposed, seeing none.
Thank you. I was also curious, noting, I'm just trying to find the page. There was a reference to, there's one operator with priority status. Curious who that operator is. Is it?
It's the Vancouver Society of Children's Centers, and it dates back to the 90s, the early 90s, I believe, with a particular focus on childcare in the Downtown Peninsula. And so that priority status remains in place for the Downtown Peninsula, but outside of the Downtown Peninsula, they would be involved in the competitive process that other operators are involved in, and was last reviewed in 2011.
Okay, thank you. I was also curious on the subject of childcare. Interesting comments, and maybe this is more to the Auditor General, around recouping costs from the provincial federal governments. Because one thing we did hear from operators through, I think, the childcare review that was undertaken by staff was that they're not having all their costs met in terms of providing nutritional meals and other. And so I think essentially the city subsidizing in some capacity when we're saying childcare is still a provincial core responsibility. I'm curious how you would structure a future lease arrangement to upload some of that to the, I was curious about the actual construct, what that could look like. So I don't know who wants to tackle that question, if that's.
I could offer some early thoughts on it, and I do think that in some ways that is the work to come, where there are a variety of ways that we could approach it, whether that's via conversation with the province or whether it's accommodation within our lease with the operators. And so we need to look at those options, and there's probably others as well. But certainly we wouldn't want to impede childcare delivery, and so we'll certainly want to understand kind of the full picture as we bring those options forward. I think we had targeted end of year for having a first look at those options.
Okay, that's great. Oh, sir.
That's your time for round one.
Okay, I'll come back on. Thanks.
And advancing Carol Bellringer. Carol?
Thank you. And I appreciate that the report itself brings forward both positive and negative, so you can see the areas where there's no recommendations. It's good to see. Just looking at all of the various management responses, I see accept recommendation throughout, and sometimes that's like no problem, and sometimes it's, well, yeah, okay, I suppose I got to do it. So without narrowing it down to each one, I'm reading between the lines on a couple of them. So the one I'm wondering about, or just generally, it appears to me that there's a fair amount of recommendations that end up formalizing things that I'm assuming you're already doing. And as a and I'll ask you if that's the case or not.
I think your perception is accurate insofar as historically this has been an under-resourced portfolio, and over the last, call it 5 years, things have really shifted with a move towards a more structured and rigorous approach. And so I do think the timing for this audit is ideal insofar as we had a number of pieces that were already underway, and then having a third party offer a new perspective helps us enhance some of those goals.
That's good to hear. On some of the dates, the target dates, I'm wondering if those are they conservative? Because some of them are quite a ways out and getting into 2026, in fact, for a couple of them, which are dependent on previous things being completed first. Do you think it's being set conservatively, or do you think it could end up that you'll get things done faster than that?
You know, you alluded to sequencing a moment ago, and I think that's kind of a key consideration in this, in that there are sort of some foundational pieces that need to be advanced around the lease monitoring framework, and just given staff resources needing to be kind of realistic about how much we can tackle at once.
Okay, thank you. And just on the last question on recommendation 9 specifically, and so this is reducing the number of leases and overhold. Is the goal on this to, I appreciate it says should reduce, but is it in effect seeking towards eliminating that? Or is it, maybe 1 or 2?
I think we can, as part of the future work on this, report back on like what is a reasonable level of overhold to have, and the report alludes to reducing the number that are in overholding in over a year. So that year timeframe seems to be like an acceptable wiggle room. And then I think the work to come is looking at the considerations that drive overhold for longer term situations and coming up with a target. You know, some of these are decades old and there's complexities behind it. And so coming up with both a time frame and some expectations in terms of what that could look like over time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Councillor Kirby Young.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm glad we have a second round. There's a lot here. I'm looking at maybe starting, I'm on page sort of, or strategies 6 and 7 of the report, page 5, in terms of what was found. And it talks about the 3 service groups and references the childcare, cultural, and social nonprofit, and says 2 out of the 3 service areas had metrics with targets and were regularly reported, but 1 did not. I wonder if you can comment on that and how did we get here in having an area that doesn't have metrics and targets and utilizing a significant city asset?
Thank you for the question. The 2 areas that have targets are the cultural spaces as well as childcare, and both of those have potentially a more clarity in terms of city targets and service delivery and the role of the city in providing that. For the social domain, providing targets presents some challenges insofar as we know that this is an area that is not wholly city responsibility, and also where there is significant gap, as well as a diversity of service types within this category. And so coming up with an aggregate target presents greater challenges. That said, we do accept the recommendation that we need to look at it more carefully.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Can I jump in there just for time? Because arguably arts is not necessarily our jurisdiction either, but we identified targets. Childcare isn't our jurisdiction either. We identified targets. So I'm wondering, in sort of looking at the nonprofit lease framework, and I don't believe the audit comments on the quality of the framework, just simply that it has yet to be fully implemented. Have we looked at other jurisdictions around there, or other cities around their practices in terms of implementing some targets or some type of utility in terms of both initially allocating nonprofit leases and then also supporting if there's performance for renewal?
We have done some jurisdictional scan as part of the development of the framework back in 2020. And certainly city practices are kind of in line in terms of providing support within those domains. And I would need to get back to you in terms of how that ties to performance metrics.
I'm sorry, it's Karen Levitt. I'm online, Deputy City Manager. If I could just add, there was substantial work done looking at other jurisdictions in the development of that the nonprofit lease framework originally.
Okay. Can council receive an updated copy and a briefing on that nonprofit framework? Since that we have the Deputy City Manager, can we get, and since that dates back to 2020 and prior to this council, can council get a briefing on that?
I could certainly confirm that we would want to do that as part of the, one of the recommendations requires us to come up with a project plan, et cetera, for it. And I think having a council briefing around that would be well suited.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And then directing a question to the Auditor General, and I'm just confirming, Am I correct in the statement that you didn't evaluate the quality of the nonprofit lease framework, just that it had not, the status of implementation was not complete?
Only in the broadest sense, Councillor Kirby-Young. I believe that a great many of the findings in this report wouldn't have been there had the framework been fully implemented. So it was certainly a very positive step. From our perspective, the biggest gap was the absence of an implementation plan with assigned responsibilities and timelines for implementing the framework. And that goes a long way to explaining why it's not yet in place. And I believe that the city is addressing that issue specifically.
Okay. And I wonder, this is also a question to the Auditor General. I wonder if you can comment around sort of the magnitude of this issue in terms of if spaces are not fully utilized, because there's an intersection obviously between if a space is not fully utilized or there's no public benefit for one, it could have gone to another nonprofit group or that revenue could have been generated at market that could then support other city initiatives. So I wonder if you can just give us kind of a sense of the impact of not having some of this diligence and structure.
The actual financial value of the portfolio isn't well understood. And so I can't tell you specifically what the value of the grants in kind are in total for the 119. I believe that's part of the process of reviewing those leases that are in very long-term overhold, for instance, and then understanding what in fact
certainly would
the
be
city's
helpful.
contribution is.
Fair to say it'd be helpful for the city to know the value, complete total value of nonprofit leases that it gives out?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. I have other questions. I'll come back.
Great, thanks. Councillor Dominato.
Thank you, Chair. So circling back, it wasn't specifically referenced, I believe, in the report, but we do, I believe, have arrangements with social enterprises that all operate as potentially retail, but are really in the business not really being, they're more not-for-profit and allowing skill building for individuals. Could you comment, was that something that was looked at in the context of these leases? So again, maybe to the Auditor General in terms of, I don't know if that was looked at. So social enterprise really not for economic benefits, but it's really to support the local economy, but specifically for individuals who may be struggling, who need to build skills, who can't work full time. So it's, we have a couple of them through some of our nonprofits. Coast Mental Health operates one. We've got Mission Possible that operates some of them in terms of social enterprise. I'm just curious, Atira as well. Is that something that was captured within this audit as being a specific, unique kind of cluster of potential clients for our leases?
Assessing the performance or the value add of individual operators wasn't part of the scope of this. We were more concerned about, was the city monitoring whether it was receiving the benefits that were outlined in the lease to start with.
Okay.
That, of course, would assume that there was a current lease in place that spelled that out, which wasn't, of course, always the case. So, but anyway, no, the actual evaluation of operator performance was outside of our scope.
Okay. Does our lease framework contemplate that? Maybe that's a question for Margaret. Is those operators?
Depending on the situation, they would be one type of operator within the social sphere, and so would be contemplated in terms of the future rigor that will be in place through the lease management framework.
Okay. Just in the interest of time, could staff or maybe the Auditor General comment on the role of ACCS and REFM in being property managers? So again, you were saying this was focused on performance and monitoring and oversight. Does this make sense from a city perspective? Should there be a different organization, third party, that oversees or operates these leases, or a head lease of some sort? This model exists. And I guess the other question to that is, did you look at the City of Toronto in the context of jurisdictions around these efforts?
I see our Deputy City Manager is standing up. She may want to weigh in on this one.
Thank you. I'll just weigh in because I was the General Manager for Arts, Culture and Community Services when the nonprofit lease management framework was created and Spaces to Thrive, the social infrastructure strategy was presented to council. We have in the past looked at whether or not an approach of head leases versus multiple smaller leases and would be operationally or strategically of interest for the city. And so that is that idea of having one organization manage a number of properties on behalf of the city is something that we're thinking about. There's trade-offs in these, right? So when leases come to council, we can align our staff recommendations with specific council strategies, whether it's food strategy, reconciliation, or as soon as you're a little bit further away from the lease management, you lose that direct kind of ability to align your leases with council priorities. So it is an area of ongoing reflection.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. Interesting to look at. I did also want to touch on, if I have time, my apologies, so I skipped through notes here. Actually, I'll just come back on if I have another question. I can't find my notes. Thanks.
Chair, if I could please, there was a question that was left hanging at the end of your last time. So if Councillor Dominato has any seconds left, I could just speak.
Yes, I do.
Dominato has 45 seconds left and wants to come back, I believe.
No, if you want to answer it.
If that would be appropriate. It was in relation to the childcare spaces and seeking other sources of funding from higher levels of government. One issue that I was very concerned about in putting that recommendation forward was that recommendation would not result in additional costs for the childcare providers themselves. That would be contrary to what the city's trying to achieve in this space. So we envisioned it much more as a flow through than as an additional cost. So part of the ongoing work that the providers would be doing in terms of recovering costs, this would just be part of that as opposed to a new ask or an add-on or an additional cost.
Okay, thank you for that
Thank you.
clarification. Councillor Kirby-Young.
Yeah, thanks. As Councillor Boyle has questions yet, I'm happy to go after because it's my second round.
Sure. Councillor Boyle.
Thanks. I actually was just going to note that I have to leave a few minutes early, so apologies that I won't be here for the rest of the report, but really appreciate the work done.
I'm just, before that happens, I'm just going to check with, do we have quorum if Councillor Boyle leaves early?
My understanding was that we would.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks.
Councillor Kirby-Young.
Yeah, thanks. Following up, I noticed that there's sort of reference important, and I think we heard from our GM as well, that there's a number of different functions and departments involved in this work, arts, cultural, community services, REFM, et cetera. Any comments from the Auditor General around if that is contributing to sort of or overcomplicating or contributing to the complexity or the sort of the, I guess, lack of current structure and discipline around this, the nonprofit leases?
Councillor Kirby-Young, we didn't identify assigned responsibilities to as different city departments as the root cause of any of the challenges.
Okay. Do you think that it is possible to establish metrics on the nonprofit social leases?
Yes, there's always opportunity to define metrics, I think, for any field of human endeavor, but they will be unique and depending on the mandate of the particular organization. My own personal experience, having been chair of the United Way of Southern Vancouver Island, it's what's required as part of their granting process is that any recipient of funds has some established metrics for understanding their performance, and this is really no different.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Okay, thanks for the work.
Great. And I'm going to add myself to the queue. And thank you for the presentation. And just a general comment, I want to reflect that this isn't really a determinant of the value of these leases, it's the valuation and reporting. And I think that's important to kind of frame this because I think that we all see the immense value in a lot of these spaces that we provide. My question is for Margaret on the overhold piece and the 29% overhold, and that is not nothing, it's fairly significant. How does staff see a path forward in addressing some of these overholds, and is that something that is easy, or How complicated is that conversation going to be?
Thank you for the question. It is an important priority and has been kind of a key priority since early 2023. Part of the reason we have so many in overholding relates to capacity and kind of an historical approach that has been less formalized. And so we're on a path right now to course correct that. That said, some of these have complexities because they've been in place, they've been in overholding for such a long period of time. And so as part of our next steps, we need to develop that plan. You know, the Auditor General's findings are reinforcing something that we knew already needed to be addressed. And so a piece of it will be to be looking at them individually and ensuring that we have a priority as well as a timeline for working through them.
And where are overhold leasees in on this? Are they anticipating this is coming forward? Are they?
It would be, you know, there's currently 26 in overholding, and so it would be quite varied. And, you know, for some, you know, maybe there's capital upgrades that are needed, and that creates complexity, or there's kind of a varying role depending on whether it's a land lease or a building lease. So each circumstance is a little bit different, and through implementing the audit findings, we'll need to kind of work through that.
Okay, well, appreciate that and the work ahead on that particular piece. Okay, seeing no further questions then, would someone like to move the recommendations? Moved by Councillor Kirby-Young, seconded by Councillor Dominato. Is there any discussion? Councillor Kirby-Young.
I'll just say this is for me, this is a particularly salient audit, and I think it's a really important piece of work. The city has, one of our largest and greatest assets is real estate. And how we utilize that real estate. And so we have a number of different constructs that govern that, whether it's the capital fund, property endowment fund, and otherwise that has certain requirements around leasing at market. And then we have a construct where we have historically provided space to be deemed worthy purposes for the benefit of Vancouverites, whether it's childcare, arts and culture, or social purpose. That said, I think that real estate is a very important asset in how it's utilized. And I appreciate kind of the insight into this. I think there's a lot of work to do, quite honestly, in putting some due diligence and structure and governance around some of this so that council and the public can have some confidence that it's being well utilized. I think when you have leases and overhold, you're not necessarily providing opportunities to other differing or emerging services potentially. I think metrics are incredibly important. I think there's lots of great nonprofit providers. It's not a comment on them, but I think it's a comment on the city in ensuring that we are getting the value that is needed in order to align with some of the greatest demands that we have in our city. And I do think that there needs to be, I want to learn more about the nonprofit leasing framework. And I also want to look at understanding if how we're doing these leases aligns with both council's priorities, but also with the key needs in our city. And so this council has talked a lot about, for example, the growing contingent of seniors in the city. We've talked a lot about food insecurity with increasing affordability issues across the city. And so it's not just in terms of what's the total value of the leases that we are giving and what are the metrics that we're getting back, but are we actually utilizing the space to deliver on the things that are really impacting Vancouverites the most? And I can't answer that question right now. And I want to be able to answer that question. So I'm looking forward to getting more information. I'm looking forward to doing some due diligence around this work. But I will say that I think that there was a lot of value in having this audit completed. I'm appreciative of some of the work that the staff are already undertaking here, but going to be looking for a lot more information and a lot of regular updates and a sense of timeline around pulling some of the more egregious pieces in the overhold into place. But it's only going to be as good as the framework that's implemented. So I also, again, really do want to learn more about that and aligning that with some of the council objective as to how we utilize a very precious asset. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Oh, Councillor Dominato.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thank you to the Auditor General for the very thorough report, and to staff for the responses and the action items that will flow from it. Very similar reflections to Councillor Kirby-Young, so I won't
take much of our time to comment on that. But I do, when I look at this as a whole, for me, some low-hanging fruit really is addressing that technology component and really that monitoring piece, which could be implemented fairly swiftly. So there's a better way of ensuring that we're tracking the timeframes of these leases, that the information that needs to be the assessment, the reassessment and reevaluation of continuing leases is actually embedded somewhere. And then the other piece, and I appreciate that the Auditor General staff said that the overhold is quite common within leasing. But when I do look at that, that again seems like a piece of work that could be undertaken fairly swiftly, particularly when we've got, I think it says 10 to 20 years and overhold 8 and 20 plus years 4. So it seems to me we should be looking closely at those ones and getting them back into compliance in terms of having an appropriate lease, because it and maybe things have changed. I don't know who those operators are in those cases, but I also appreciate the comment around getting more information around the nonprofit lease framework. So look forward to that update, but happy to receive this report and look forward to further updates.
Thanks, Councillor. Okay. We've had a mover and a seconder, I believe. Yep. And so we can run a vote. Seeing no further discussion. And that passes with none opposed and Councillor Boyle absent. Okay, that concludes the agenda. Do we have a motion to adjourn? By Councillor Dominato, seconded by Councillor Kirby-Young. All in favor? Yay. Nay. This motion carries unanimously. This meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.